You are listening to the Ponchatoula Podcast with your host, Parker Layrisson. We bring you local news and community interviews from the Ponchatoula-Hammond area. Located at the crossroads of I-12 and I-55, deep in the bayous of South Louisiana. Parker is a husband, father, personal injury attorney, author, and community volunteer who is on a mission to share the unique food, culture, events, and people of Ponchatoula with the world. And here's your host, Parker Layrisson.
Imagine the most interesting man in the world. What if I told you he lives right here in Ponchatoula and that you could hear from him? Wouldn't you love to listen to a truly entertaining story told to you by this man? The type of story that starts in the good old days, in his case, the Ponchatoula of the 1940s and 50s. The type of story that ends with one of those happily ever after, truly storybook endings. If that's the kind of tale that you'd like to hear, you're going to love this episode of the Ponchatoula Podcast, because I'm bringing to you the most interesting man in the world, or at least the most interesting man in my life. Now, when some of us hear the most interesting man in the world, we can't help but think of those great Dos Equis beer ads. I'm sure you can conjure up the image, a bearded, graying, debonair man of mystery telling you, stay thirsty, my friends. The kind of guy that says, I don't always drink beer, but when I do, it's Dos Equis. I love those ads. They were really effective. I thought they were great. And I also loved the jokes that came out of them. They reminded me of those Chuck Norris jokes that you can get online. They say things like, his only regret is not knowing what regret feels like. Well, today's guest was also the face of beer, but long ago. And this most interesting man was the face of Dixie beer in the 1970s. And if you want to see a 1970s Dixie beer can with his face on it, just come by my office. I'll be happy to show you. There's a mustached man of the Wild West drinking a thick, frosty glass of ice cold beer in a Wild West saloon. Looks like a real life Chuck Norris joke. And it's my dad, James Edward Layrisson. He is the single most talented person I've ever met. He was a great athlete, a great scholar. He's a great conversationalist. He's great at many things, but he's also the toughest and kindest person that I know. My dad's just got the biggest heart you'll ever see. It's easy to see why he's my lifelong hero. And he's my hero. When I say that, just know it has nothing to do with the fact that he spent his career as Tangipahoa's most successful and longest serving sheriff. I'm certainly proud of those accomplishments, that he did well at that. But that has nothing to do with him being my hero. It has everything to do with the fact that he was smart and funny and charitable and still is. He's just got the biggest heart you'll find. If you're his friend, then you know that's a blessing. He's the best friend and father in the world to his 4 sons, his 13 grandchildren, and his many, many friends. In fact, I think it's pretty neat because as we are recording this podcast right now, James Edward Layrisson II, that's my younger boy, is sleeping, being babysat by his grandmother right across town. And he's growing up here in Ponchatoula in the same town that James Edward Layrisson I did 75 years ago. In fact, he's living right now on the same street that his papa used to live on. So that's pretty cool. So here at the Ponchatoula Podcast, I don't always interview family, but when I do, it's epic. And I promise you're going to love it. So if you want to hear stories about the good old days here in Ponchatoula, told by the guy who lived them, stay tuned for my interview with Eddie Layrisson. Welcome back to the Ponchatoula Podcast. I am your host, Parker Layrisson, and today I am incredibly excited to interview one of my lifelong heroes, in fact, the paramount hero in my life, my dad, Eddie Layrisson. So, Pop, of course, I know you well, but for our listeners, some of whom have just moved here to Ponchatoula recently, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are?
Hi, I'm James Edward Layrisson. I was born in New Orleans. I was adopted as an infant by 2 wonderful people, Louis and Inez Layrisson. I came to Ponchatoula as an infant, and I've moved a couple of times through education and jobs in my younger life, but I've always returned. It's just the best place in the world.
Well, thank you for saying that. That's neat, because one thing I ask every person that comes on the podcast is, why do you choose to live in Ponchatoula? Whether you're someone who grew up here like you and I, or someone who just moved to town recently, you have really lived in some of the coolest places in the world. The first one that comes to mind is Sausalito. You lived on a boat in Sausalito with all these famous rock stars, and that's the wealthiest county in the country for a reason. It's beautiful, it's diverse. You could live anywhere in the world. Why did you choose to come home to Ponchatoula and to make your life here and raise us kids here?
Well, there's just something about Ponchatoula that just has a magnetic quality. I was unconscious of it most of my life, being raised in the 50s as a teenager, in the 60s as a college student and stuff. But there's just a fabric here. There's an easiness and a kind of an understanding. I was sheriff for 25 years. I was raised here. We've never had horrible hate-type situations that have occupied other pockets of our country. Mm-hmm. We've always been an understanding, almost classless society. Nobody really sits in judgment in Ponchatoula very much. It's just been a wonderful place to be raised. Yeah. And it's like a magnet. It does draw you back. It's home, for sure.
Well, I can relate to that for sure. Well, speaking of your family history, before we get into your childhood here, beginning with adoption in the 40s and high school in the 50s and college in the 60s, I know that our family moved here long ago, all the way from Michigan. So why don't you give our listeners a little bit of history about our family and kind of where they came from and how they got here?
I'm not certain I recall all of it, except my mother's family came down from Michigan. They were the Parkers. Matter of fact, my mother and her only sister, Aunt Meyer, were called the Parker sisters for ages and ages and ages. They came down, her father came down, Elmer Parker came down with the Branches, who is also a well-known family here in Ponchatoula. And
that would be the Branches of Branch Real Estate, right?
That's correct.
Wesley Daniels and Charlene Daniels and Charlie Branch.
It's really, that's another great thing about Ponchatoula. I think you and your family will have 4 or 5 generations of close friends that migrated down here from Michigan. It's really a unique kind of situation.
That's neat.
I remember as a child going back to Michigan when many of their nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles were alive. They had a farm near Lansing, Michigan, and I think the family originally was from St. John, Michigan.
Okay.
But I remember cherry orchards and currant fields and things like that were all part of the Michigan farm.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you know what brought them down here? Was it an economic opportunity? Was it family? Or was it a marriage? What
there was
it?
Another family from Michigan, the Hollister family, who were lifelong friends of mine, and of course, very close to my mother and father. But their grandfather opened a syrup mill right here on the Springfield Highway.
Oh, cool.
So those 3 families came down to establish that new industry here.
Okay. And that's the Parker family, which is your mother,
That's
Inez.
correct.
I believe you mentioned her, your grandfather, Elmer Parker, who went by E.D. Parker. He was a mayor of Ponchatoula at one time, right?
That's correct. He was the mayor. I really never knew him. Of course, I knew his wife, who I affectionately call Mommy.
Yeah.
And her house was right in the backyard of our house when I was growing up, and right next to Aunt Myra Vaughn.
And across the street from where you live now by the Strawberry Festival at Memorial Park, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's the old home block over there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the other side of the family. Your father, Louis Layrisson, at some point moved down from Washington Parish to build the Knee-High building, right? Where they made Knee-High soda and RC Cola. Is that right?
Right. Dad was owner of the Knee-High Bottling Company. His father had started that business, and it was located in Bogalusa, just about the time or near the time I was born or whatever. Dad moved that business right here to Ponchatoula, and the first Knee-High Bottling Company was right near where Ballard's station is, right now over in that block. It was an old wooden building. Mm-hmm. I was just a tiny boy, and I could maybe have still glimpses of, I could still see the old building and some old trucks in it or whatever, but I don't have a whole lot of personal recollection.
Right.
the new building was built when I was 4 or 5 years old, which was the brick building over on East Pine Street.
Okay. Across the street from First Baptist Church at the corner of 3rd Street, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So my whole boyhood, our house was right next door to that building, so I was raised right there. And I guess in the olden days, I went to work as maybe 10 or 11, 12 years old, being an inspector, watching the bottles come out of the washing machine to make sure they were all clean.
Yeah, I would have applied for quality control and tried to drink some of the cola. Did you ever get in on that?
The Dufreche boys and I, who were my neighbors at the time, we managed a lot of quality control.
That's neat. Well, speaking of the Dufreche boys in that location, I would be remiss if and I think that, for you law enforcement investigators out there, I think the statute of limitations is run here. So as your family attorney, I can advise you, it's now okay to talk about the Dufreche Layrisson fire of 1940-something. Can you tell us about that? I think it's a great story.
We were always playing and always in some kind of mischief. And in that time, right behind my house in the knee-high plant, the homes weren't built yet. It was pretty, it was pretty much wooded area back there. So during those days, they used to have a lot of old World War II movies that we got to watch. And in them, the Americans, of course, were always chasing the Nazis or whatever, and the planes would be shot and they would came flaming down to the ground. So we decided, as little boys in mischief might do, that it would be great to take mosquito hawks and soak them in gasoline and light them on fire. I hope
my kids never listen to this podcast.
I hope so too. I hope my grandchildren know. But anyway, we were doing that one day, and someone got a little too close with the match and lit the lid of the jug which I was holding, which the gasoline in it. It was an old glass bottle that knee-high syrup used to come in. And what gave me the presence of mind at the time, I don't know, but I threw the jug and it went into my father's shed. And of course, it was just a huge explosion. The entire shed was on fire within seconds. And we were so scared that we ran and hid in the woods. It was late afternoon.
Wow.
So the fire department came. It was a huge blaze. It took them forever to get it out. We were still hiding. It was just getting dark. And we knew we were in big, big trouble.
So the flip side of the coin is your parents rush out to see a fire in the backyard where they knew you were playing, and the building where you'd last been in is erupting in flames, and they don't see you. There's no sign of you.
Mom and Dad were there, Buddy Dufreche, and my mom and Dad, everybody was screaming and crying. It was a horrible scene. And they finally got the fire out, and it was still smoldering, and they couldn't find any bodies.
Oh, wow.
The bodies were all hidden in the woods. So when we came out, my only recollection, which I remember to this day, 76 years later, was my dad hugging me and then spanking me. Hugging me and then spanking me.
Back and forth, right? The agony
it was quite
and the
a sensation.
Oh, wow. That's a great story. I'll be right back with the rest of our interview in just a moment. You know how car crash victims struggle to pay for the medical care they need? Well, at the Parker Layrisson Law Firm, we help busy families recover after car accidents so that they can rest easy, pay their medical expenses without worry, and move forward with their lives. We do this by sharing our free accident handbook, battling Goliath insurance companies, and treating our clients like family. Our clients say we help them save time and recover the money they deserve so that they can focus on getting well and living normal lives again. If you were injured in a car, truck, or motorcycle accident, give us a call now, 985-467-9525. Well, tell me about any, other things that happened as a child there. Well, did y'all have a good time? Let me back this up. Let's talk about some other folks besides the Dufreche kids you grew up with. Obviously, you have one brother, Donnie.
Right.
Donnie's how much older than you?
Donnie's 5 years older.
Okay, and you just got back from visiting him a few days ago or a week or so ago, right?
Yeah, he's in a nursing home in near Alexandria, yeah. Okay,
so you have one brother, and then you have a cousin that's particularly close to you, and that would be Jackie Vaughn, right?
Yeah, Jackie was Aunt Myra's son, all three of us were adopted at different times.
Okay. And, so the two Parker sisters have 3 kids by adoption.
Right.
And you guys are raised really close. And
absolutely. Yeah.
Jackie Vaughn, of course, would ultimately be my godfather, who I just loved before he passed away. Tell us about, and Jackie was a few years older than you too, right? Was he close to Uncle Donnie's age?
Jackie and Donnie were the same age.
Okay.
Jackie was just, he just adopted me as a kid. I was really his little brother in a way. I went everywhere with him. Of course, he was my idol. Jackie was a great football and baseball player. Matter of fact, his jersey number was 16. He was 5 years later, I finally made the Ponchatoula team and chose jersey 16.
Oh, so that's where your number came from.
Yeah, that's where my number
came from. And you both
came
played
from.
Quarterback at Ponchatoula High, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. But Jackie went on to play ball at Mississippi State, played baseball. I had some great adventures up there, going up to state. My Uncle Jack was a big state supporter. And I got to stay in the athletic dorm with all Americans like Billy Stacy and Jackie Parker and stuff like that. So as a kid, it was just a great story.
Yeah, wow, that's so neat. And he went on to become an NFL referee, right?
Jackie, refereed in NFL for years and years. Yeah.
And his son Scott is now a 3rd-generation SEC referee in football, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Well, that's really neat. And Uncle Donnie went on to be an entrepreneur, right? Didn't he have another bottling company?
When my dad died, my mother, for a few years, ran the Knee-High bottling company. And then after I graduated from Tulane, and all my brother and I ran it. And during that time, Donnie started a separate business called Dad's Root Beer.
Okay.
And it was more of a regional, rather than a local product like ours. It was more of a regional deal. And Don, he did real well. He worked real hard, and he did real well, yeah.
Well, you mentioned your father and losing him at an early age. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about my grandfather, Louis Layrisson? Louis
Layrisson was quite a character. Of course, he was a very successful businessman in Knee-High and Royal Grand Cola. It was a Depression-type drink when it became its most popular. For years and years, it was one of the leaders selling products in the country. And Dad did real well. He had the plant here. We had a warehouse in Bogalusa. But what he also did, he was a pitcher for the famous Ponchatoula Athletics, who, as we all know, had won national championships as a semi-pro team and stuff. And Dad pitched almost up until he was 50 years old.
Wow.
He went from a fastball, curveball pitcher to a knuckleball pitcher in the end. But I got to see a lot of that when I was a young kid at Athletic Park. Of course, Dad was also super instrumental in with Buddy Dufreche and Lemmy Contreras and the Reagans and some other people of getting our athletic park built. And
a generation later, you and some sons of the same families would renovate that, right?
That's correct.
Julian Dufreche and his brothers and Andy Edwards and others.
That's correct. And of course, the Dufreche's father, Buddy, was like an idol to me. He was like a coach and
Was he also mayor of Ponchatoula?
Oh, yes, he was the mayor of Ponchatoula. Yeah.
And I know he eventually became your mentor in politics. And
absolutely.
Hopefully we'll have time to talk about that part of your career in another podcast later. Well, that's neat. And folks, for those of you listening, if we have any Ponchatoula baseball fans out there or any people who appreciate Athletic Park, feel free to touch base with me here in my office. My dad has shared with me, and also Mr. Danny Dufreche has shared with us, some wonderful old pictures of the Ponchatoula athletics teams and a few American Legion teams from Ponchatoula dating back to the 30s and 40s and 50s. They're really neat. And on some of them have lists of the names on back. It's great treasure. So, Dad, thanks for sharing those with me. And I just want our listeners to know that we have them here at the office if they want to come see them.
Yeah, they really are neat.
Well, moving on from your father, tell us about your mother, Inez, my grandmother. What was she like?
Oh, Inez was just a gracious, very Southern lady. Inez had a big heart. She worked with the Catholic charities and things of that nature. She and Aunt Myra were, 30, 40 year aides up at the hospital, volunteer aides at the hospital, the Pink Ladies.
I remember that. The candy stripers, Yeah.
They had a bridge game that had gone on for maybe 40 or 50 years, and it was called The Girls when they were all in their 80s. But she was wonderful. She loved her children. She was a great organizer. She was an independent woman for those days. She and Aunt Myra both ran Parker Insurance Agency.
Right.
And they ran it for years and years, which was, and Willie Branch, of course, one of the Michigan ladies.
Yeah, the Michigan ladies
we
really
had some pretty independent business ladies way before that was in its vogue.
Yeah, they were pioneers.
They were very much pioneers, yeah, and ran very successful businesses. So. But as a mother, she was just the best. She spoiled me rotten.
Yeah.
She spoiled you all rotten.
Oh, she was a great grandmother, boy.
Yeah, so.
Yes, sir.
Just a pretty special person.
That's neat. One of my favorite photos I've ever seen in my life is Aunt Myra and grandmother at their little tea party. I think it was 1909 or it was somewhere in the first decade of the 20th century. And they were just out there dressed to the nines, like you say, Southern late, just little Southern belles, having a tea party in front of their house, which I guess was at Mommy's house, the big white one on the corner by Ponchatoula Memorial Park.
That was your great-great-grandmother. That was Mama's house. Mommy and Mama were next door neighbors.
Oh, wow.
Daughter and
a lot of fun nicknames for the grandmothers in my family. Well, that's really neat. Well, tell me, Dad, about your childhood in Ponchatoula. We wouldn't be complete without getting to your best friend, Carl Cleveland. And let's start with Carl's parents, Ned and Patricia Richardson, because with the Richardson hardware store and the nursery and the Tangipahoa River, those guys were total icons in my childhood and yours. And I know they played a big part in your childhood. So tell us about Ned and Patricia, and we'll get to Carl in a bit.
Yeah, Ned and Patricia became my dad died when I was 16, and that's kind of no time's good, but during those tender years, it's pretty rough to lose a parent. I was very close to my father. And Ned and Patricia just became like my surrogate parents. They were just tremendous to me all my life. And of course, their son was my best friend or whatever. But I spent in high school, maybe half my days on the river at their home and half my days was in town, as did Carl. We just bounced back and forth. But they were just tremendous people. Patricia was a New Orleans girl originally. Her father and grandfather, her grandfather started the Newcomb School of Art. His name was Woodward. He's a very famous artist.
So very prominent, well-to-do New Orleans family.
She was very, very, very well-educated, very articulate. The greatest hostess I've ever seen. Every weekend at the river was a party, feeding tons of people, and with just elegance and grace.
Yeah.
And just one of my ultimate heroes. And Ned was this homespun Ponchatoula son of a hardware man who ended up running Richardson's hardware for ages and ages and ages. And Ned was just, he had that dry, slow humor. He was too late educated, like your father is.
Yeah.
So he wasn't the dullest knife in the drawer.
Sure, yeah.
But he sure played it low key.
Yeah, right.
But Ned, I just spent hours and hours and hours at the hardware. He had a little coffee nook in the back. And you just sit there and hear Ned's stories one after another of all of his exploits in the big war.
Yeah, he
and
was
living in Russia during the
yeah.
big war. And he was just a wonderful human being.
Yeah, well, it's neat. You mentioned earlier the multi-generational friendships that Ponchatoula has. And there's no better example than the Richardsons and the Layrissons, because it goes that far back. And, just this morning, I strolled my boys over and dropped Luke off at Strawberry Castle Preschool. And the first guy he runs up to and talks to is Fisher Richardson, which is Ned's great-grandson, my best friend, Will Richardson, who was, speaking of Tulane, my Tulane roommate. And, it's really neat to kind of see that. Here we are, so many years later, and those family lines are still really close. His grandsons, Will and Ben, are both godfathers to my two boys. So that's
part
really
of the
neat.
Ponchatoula Magic.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, their son, Carl, Patricia's second boy, she had four boys, you mentioned earlier, was your lifelong best friend. He is certainly the single greatest attorney to ever come out of Ponchatoula and Tangipahoa Parish. We are doing this podcast right now, sitting at his desk from his office in New Orleans,
correct,
which is one of my. I have two desks in my life, and you mentioned earlier the Parker Insurance Company. I have my grandmother's desk from her insurance business at the house, and Uncle Carl's law firm desk here at my office, and they're two treasures. But tell us about Carl, starting at the beginning in childhood, and we could talk about what a dear friend he was to you over the course of his life. But
Carl was just my, he was like my best friend for life almost. I think we met in the 1st or 2nd grade at St. Joseph's School. I don't know what brought us together in such a strong fashion, but we stayed that way. We went through St. Joseph's together. We played football and basketball all through Ponchatoula High together. We both went to Tulane with offers of football scholarships to Tulane, and Carl ended up having a good career there. But he and I were just joined at the hip for all that time. We hunted, we fished, we played all the sports. We did everything, and we just had a bond that was just one of the strongest bonds of my life.
Yeah.
And I miss him so much today after all these years still.
Yeah. He was such a larger-than-life character. I mean,
my gosh.
As a kid, he would come up to our camp in Manchac, and we'd be down there, with a little skiff that we catch crabs in, or a shrimp boat, and he'd pull up in a paddle wheeler with, his 6 daughters and 12 of their friends, and it was like another world. He was
Carl. He just that mind of his never shut down. It was just always working. I could recall in the 7th or 8th grade, we had mostly nuns in those days at St. Joseph's, and they all wore their habits. We secretly, quietly called them old crows for the black and white habits, which was very disrespectful in those days. So I remember one day Carl made one of those paper airplanes that we all made, and he put Sister Mildred, who was the teacher before us, as an old crow, and he sailed it out the window, and everybody was laughing, oh boy. And then all of a sudden, as God would have it, it came right back in. We had no air conditioner, though. Came right back in and landed on Sister Mildred's desk.
No, that's too funny.
But anyway, that's the kind of things Carl did constantly.
Wow, that's funny. That's a great Uncle Carl story, and that's a great God story, too. He's got a sense of humor, obviously. Well, you guys got in a ton of fun mischief over the years. One thing I know about you that I heard about growing up was that you guys would double dip at dinner. Is that true, that you would kind of do the old stovepipe commercial?
I think we got by with it for about 2.5 years before one day my mother asked Patricia at Bridge Club or whatever, Carl's mother, do you ever feed Carl? She looked at Aunt Ed and said, do you ever feed Eddie? We had been double dipping after football practice for about 3 years with those horrendous appetites we had.
That's funny. That's funny. Well, we started your childhood friend stories talking about you and the Dufreche boys catching fire to your dad's shed. I understand there was also a fire caper with you and Carl at Ponchatoula High School. Is there any truth to that rumor that you almost burned down the high school?
Total rumor. We had this wonderful new teacher named Fernie Ray Gill, and Ponchatoula had worked real hard, including us, getting a new physics lab and physics classroom built with all kind of special places for the acids and stuff like that.
Right.
So the superintendent of school, and Mr. Butler was our principal, who we all were scared to death of.
That would be Mr. Willard Butler?
Mr. Willard Butler, quite a character. I've got some stories later we could tell about him. But they were bringing in the superintendent of the state to take pictures and photographs of our new modern science lab, and we were all so proud of it. So Fernie Ray gave Carl and I think the project was to make some bromide gas, which is a brown, poisonous gas, but it was in a controlled situation.
Sure.
So this is true, just as the superintendent and the photographers were coming in, Carl poured, which was supposed to be something like a milliliter of sulfuric acid, he poured 10 milliliters of sulfuric acid. And literally, the cloud went up as a brown, poisonous cloud. We had to evacuate the entire school.
This was a chemical weapon in 1950s Ponchatoula.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Well, speaking of Carl and Mr. Butler, it's my understanding that you and Uncle Carl did very well as students. Obviously, you went to Tulane, but as seniors do, as I certainly did at Ponchatoula High in the 90s, you had senior skip day, and you got caught, and Mr. Butler called you to the office one day around that time. Why don't you tell folks about that story? How'd that go down?
Well, first of all, you'd have to preface that with everybody was scared to death of Mr. Butler. And in 4 years at Punchy High, and he was a great leader. But this is a totally off story. But I had really never seen him smile. He was very serious.
Disciplinarian, if ever there was one.
As it would be his way of handling things, he made me sit out on this cypress bench right out of his office for maybe 45 minutes, at which time my little adolescent brain went over and over. Should I tell the truth and get thrown out? Or can I get by with a lie? What do you think?
Can I sell the lie?
Can I sell the lie? So I waited and squirmed and squirmed. I said, oh, well. Finally, I said, what would Daddy tell me to do? Daddy would say, tell the truth. So in our march, I proceeded to tell him the exact truth that we had skipped school, went to New Orleans, were bad boys, drank beer, whatever we did, which and he sat there with this stern face, and he looked at me and he said, well, Layrisson, I called you in here to tell you you're salutatorian of the class. He said, now I don't even know if you'll graduate. And for the first time, I saw him smile.
Oh, that's great. That's a great story. And I think you actually, speaking of Carl, you edged out your best friend Carl, who was third in the class, right? Now, also, there was around that time an issue, and I think this is a good story about your mother, my grandmother, and what a fierce advocate she could be for her boys. You were Mr. PHS in 1960 when you graduated, but didn't you at first maybe pass on the honor? And how did that all go down? How'd that go over with grandmother when you maybe attempted?
Oh, you're talking about the Mr. PHS?
Yeah, Mr. PHS. And it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dad, but my recollection from her is that in the 60s, unlike today, you were not allowed to win a bunch of awards your senior year. You know, Mr. PHS would be the top award, but if you got that award, you were not also then eligible to be the best athlete, the best at English, whatever, most likely to succeed, whatever the honorifics were. But tell us how that went, and correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that our listeners need to know that distinction between then and now to understand.
Yeah,
the
well,
story.
you could only receive one of the awards. I got a call from one of the teachers at school that said after the first ballot that I was leading in best male athlete and Mr. PHS, but I could only do one or the other. And of course, to me at that time, and you're 16 years, 17 years old, you're not into what the honors are. So athletics were my interest. You know, I was a quarterback or whatever. So I said, I'll go for the athletics. And I hung up and later told Mother about it, and she just had a hissy because she was into whatever that was. So I had to call them back and tell them, oh no, I switched. So that's how that came about.
Smart move. That's funny. Well, so some of the people there that we haven't gotten to yet in your high school experience have been just, legends of the lore of Ponchatoula of my childhood. And two that stick out in my mind most prominently are your coaches. Coach Shield, the head football coach, and Coach Johnson, who was his assistant in football and the head basketball coach.
Right.
So why don't we start with Coach Shield and tell us about him and what his impact was on you?
Coach Shield was just one of the most honorable men I've ever met. He was a strong, John Wayne, quiet type. He loved football. He loved hunting and fishing. He came down from Mississippi. He played ball, I believe, at Texas A&M when Bear Bryant was the coach. But he was one of the
Junction Boys, huh?
He was one of the original Junction Boys. So you can believe during August and in September, hot practices and all, we were never allowed a drop of water.
And Pop, if you'll let me interrupt just to make this, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, Google it, and if you have the time, watch I believe it was an ESPN documentary on the Junction Boys, and you'll get a feel for this. But this was Coach Bear Bryant, the great Alabama legend in his Texas A&M days, running the harshest training days for football players in the history of mankind. And tell us about the water restrictions. I guess at the time they didn't understand hydration. Is that right?
Yeah, they didn't understand hydration, and they just thought it made you tough and made you in better shape if you didn't ever receive any water or any kind of drinks or anything. that we didn't. It reminds me one time, can you imagine being out with all that equipment on and running?
Yeah.
You had to run 10 or 12 wind sprints every morning.
Yeah, summer heat,
humid
after
Louisiana. Before practice and all. And then you have the hours of practice. Your mouth is just cotton, just total cotton. But
it was tough in my childhood with all the water you could drink. So
I remember we used to practice on a field called Miss Snell's Field, where the nursing home is over there now. Mm-hmm. And when it would rain, the water would collect in the ditch. There were big ditches on the side of it. And we actually had a play. I was the quarterback, and we'd go back in the huddle. And unbeknownst to the coaches, I'd call 18 lateral, which is a quarterback run around left end.
Like a sweep.
A sweep.
Okay.
And the offensive lineman would run up and give the nod to the defense.
They had a signal for the guy across the line?
Oh, that's great. And off I'd go, miraculously not tackled until we hit the ditch. And we'd actually drink that fresh rainwater out of the ditch.
Wow. So you're drinking ditch water.
We thought it was the greatest thing in the world.
Wow. Ponchatoula, where the ditch water is the nectar of the gods. Right. That's amazing. Uh-huh. Well, I've certainly remember what a big deal it was to you when Coach Shield passed, and you've talked just so fondly of him over the years. It sounds like you were really blessed to have such a strong mentor as your head coach.
He was just a man, a great principal. He loved football, but more than that, he loved developing young men. He loved working with people. He was a strong, quiet type. And we were very successful under his leadership, mostly because of that leadership, because we certainly weren't the biggest and fastest and strongest of all the teams, you know.
Mm-hmm. And y'all had a successful season your senior year, right?
Yeah, we had successful season all 3 years. I was there,
Well, tell us about, I know that you were a quarterback your senior year. Mm-hmm. Before that, you had been a halfback playing behind a quarterback who was a real Louisiana and Ponchatoula legend.
Yeah, Dwight Robinson.
Yeah, tell us about him. He would go on to
Dwight
LSU.
Was a tremendous athlete. He and I were very good friends. Dwight just worked hard. He was super competitive. He was a really good quarterback. Mm-hmm. He got a scholarship to LSU right after they had won the national championship. I think that was 57 or so.
Yeah, so they win in 58. He graduates high school in 59.
Yeah. So he went over there, and the Chinese bandits were still a program, and they switched him from quarterback to defense, and he played on that famous Chinese bandit defense.
Oh, that's neat. So, that's such a great story.
That was a great deal.
Yeah.
Dwight was a good friend. He and I were very close.
Now, I remember a story about you playing quarterback, and of course, our arch rivals here in Ponchatoula are the Hammond High Tornadoes. And I believe you tied him in your senior year in a really hard-fought game. But tell us the story about you getting tackled, really getting your bell rung, and maybe by Mr. Ronnie Bankston, who I know was one of the hardest-hitting defensive players of that era. Somebody else, I don't know. But you look up and you see this beautiful face who happens to be your girlfriend, but it maybe doesn't go the way you're expecting. Tell us about all the characters involved and that story.
Parker, you can really bring up the zingers here. Yeah, I had been dating a beautiful girl named Vern Fitzgerald, who was Miss Tangipahoa in those days or whatever. And Vern and I had been going out some time. It just happened that Vern went to Hammond High in those days, a real big arch enemy.
Right.
And Vern was a cheerleader. So both my junior and senior year, the scores were 7-7 and 6-6. So that's how tight the competition was with Hammond and Ponchatoula in those days. But anyway, I was making a run, one of those sweeps around the right side. And in those days, Southeastern had a cinder track with cement borders around it, around the football field.
Yeah.
So I'm running around there, and it might have been Ronnie, he probably was. Somebody just smashes me as I'm running towards the sideline, and off I go into the track. My knee hits the cement rail. The cinders just rip the skin off my arm, and I'm lying there in total misery.
Yeah. And
I look up, and surrounding me are all, including my girlfriend, with purple pom-poms going, yay! Naturally, it put a chill on the relationship.
That's a great one. Well, tell us, Dad, from that era, are there any other characters that stick out that we've neglected? Because I don't want to leave anybody
there were
out.
just so many. I mean, you mentioned earlier, our assistant coach was just
Coach
the most
Bill Johnson. Let's
fascinating
go
man.
there.
He
Yeah,
ended up
absolutely.
being a lifelong friend of mine and a lifelong torturer of me.
Yeah. So this
Bill
would be
Johnson.
Coach Bill Johnson. Yeah,
Coach
great.
Bill Johnson was like a nightmare.
And, tell us about some of his nightmarish tactics.
One of his favorite things. Bill was just this short little rooster of a guy. But he would sit on top of this gigantic blocking sled that they had made from Louisiana cypress lumber. And it was huge and it weighed a ton. And he would sit on top with a stick. And he'd holler at you when you're driving and pushing the sled and you get all you could. And he just starts hitting you in the helmet with it.
With a stick?
With a stick. And you bell him on.
Oh, wow.
But he was quite a character. And he was also our basketball coach and really a tremendous coach. But boy, he had a competitive spirit and a temper that was unbelievable.
Yeah, well, there's a great story in there about the coaching days. The two things that come to mind, and tell in whatever order you like, but I remember the scoring record where you had your personal high of most points scored in the tournament and sprained your ankle. And the other one would be, I don't know whether it was a suspension or a break from the team somehow. Tell us about those and how those situations played out.
Oh, my goodness. The best part was we were having one of those hot practices one day, and my best friend Carl, who was a great football player, matter of fact, he got a scholarship to Tulane to play college ball, but he was not the greatest basketball player, although he was big.
Right.
But he had kind of two left feet in basketball. Yeah. So anyway, the coach having no tolerance for anything but perfection, one day we were practicing and his temper got the best of him. He took the ball and he just slammed it right in Carl's face. So Carl was also huge. He was big and strong. So just Carl,
he was a tackle on the Tulane team.
Yeah, he was an offensive tackle and defensive. We both played both ways all the time, all of us. But anyway, Carl was going after him, and we all had to stop the deal. So he threw Carl off the team. Although he initiated the foul. So when Carl went to the locker room, so did I, who was the starting point guard at the time.
You stood with your best friend. How'd Coach Johnson react to that?
He came in the locker room and almost started another one, and we had to get Carl off of him again. But anyway, so we left, and about a week later, he calls me in his office. Well, I think we were undefeated, or maybe with one loss during the Christmas holidays, and I think they lost 2 or 3 in that 2-week period or 10-day period. So he calls me into his office, and I'll never forget his line was, "Layrisson, I think you've been punished enough." And I knew it was killing him to lose. He couldn't stand to lose.
He was such a competitor.
But he was a character.
Well, it's funny to me because when I think of Bill Johnson, of course, I was raised with him being one of your best friends and being so great. He would just spoil me and my brothers. And, he's just so good to mom and come by drinking coffee. And it's so funny to contrast that with these stories of him hitting y'all in the head with sticks and, picking fights with students. And
part just of the whole toughen them up routine.
And then the other thing there was, I think you guys were playing in a tournament, and you're like 2 points away from your personal scoring record. And tell us about that.
We're playing, I think, Baker or somebody. We're going to the South Louisiana Championships in basketball or something like that. I think I'd scored 29, and I never broke 30. So I said, "Coach, put me in, just one play. Let me do one shot." So he reluctantly put me in because we had the next day another playoff game. He reluctantly put me in. I run the court. I score my 31. I come down, and my ankle ends up about as big as a balloon.
Oh, yikes.
I sprained my ankle unbelievably bad. The next game, I scored 2 points. I played in about a minute.
And you lost.
So once again, Coach had very good reason to hate me.
Now I can get a feel for why he treated you like he did. That's a great one. Well, let's talk a little more. You mentioned Vern, and Mama, don't get mad at me for talking about Dad's ex-girlfriends. He loves you. Y'all been happily married for 40-plus years. But I remember, one of the differences between Ponchatoula then and now, which you alluded to earlier about the wood. To think that the woods would be one block from Pine Street to me is just not fathomable in 2018. But back then there weren't that many paved roads.
No.
And you mentioned you're dating Hammond cheerleaders, and is it true that you would ride your bike from Ponchatoula to Hammond on a gravel road? I mean, how'd that all go down?
We used to, in the old days, Ponchatoula, and it's a shame the world's changed as much, but basically children were allowed to do anything unsupervised. I mean, we played sandlot football and baseball and work-up baseball and things all over the place. We rode bikes everywhere. But before I had my driver's license, I fell in love with a girl in Hammond.
Which, by the way, I think you got your driver's license when you were 14 or something, right? 13,
correct.
Something crazy.
I got a
young.
hardship license at 14, I think.
Wow.
But
so before then,
so 13.
At age 13.
So I drive up. Her name was Diane Bradley. Her daddy was Winston Bradley, who's a legend in Hammond and is another hero of mine. I was lucky to have a lot of good mentors in my life.
Yeah.
But anyway, I rode up the Range Road, which was called the Brickyard Road in those days, and it was all gravel.
Which is the road right next to my office.
Next
The
to
5th Street
here.
becomes Range Road.
Yeah.
So that right here.
So I rode up Brickyard Road up to Hammond. Winston lived right out by the college. So I knocked on the door, and Mr. Winston opened the door, and I guess I was 14. He said, "Hey, boy, what you doing here?" I said, "I came to see Diane." He said, "Where's your car?" I said, "I don't have a license yet, Mr. Winston." Well, he was friends with my mom and dad. He must have been chuckling.
Right.
So anyway, he said, "Come on in." So I came in. He gave me the keys to a brand new Cadillac to take Diane, I think, to Russia's, the old hamburger place.
Oh, wow.
And ever since that day, I call Winston my hero.
Oh, yeah. Wow,
yeah.
I bet.
Oh, yeah.
I bet. Now, was this Mr. Winston Bradley that had the camp out on the Tangipahoa River?
Correct.
Oh, yeah. He's a local legend for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's neat. The other high school girlfriend car story I remember from your childhood, and I want you to verify whether this is true or not, because I think I remember Uncle Carl or one of your friends talking about you guys would get so overheated after practice that you would ride on the hoods or the roofs of the car and let your girlfriends drive you around town to cool you off and dry you off. Is it truth to that? How'd that go down?
That's a true story. We had no air conditioning in those days, you got to remember. And
this would be the late 50s up to 1960.
Yeah, so how we recovered after being so overheated doing all that practice is that Dwight Robinson and I and our two girlfriends, Vern was mine now, I guess, we would go up and jump in Chapapilla Creek where our farm is now.
Yeah, in that cold water, yeah.
And we had a swimming hole up there. And we'd get in Chapapilla Creek, I felt like your body would just go when you jump in, you were so hot. And then we would sit on the fenders of the trucks, and the girls would drive us all around those country roads. It's like that was our air conditioning system. You know? But we did that almost every day.
So basically, you got the same routine that I now see your Labrador get from you whenever you're out at the farm. That's funny. Well, Pop, tell us about some of the places you like to go. You mentioned Russia's with your girlfriend, and it strikes me as we sit here today. Just this morning, as we sit here, as we're talking. Your wife is babysitting James Edward Layrisson II. It's 2018, and it's just such a vastly different place than it was when James Edward Layrisson I was growing up. So tell us what it was like back then, and where did you go? What was it like? We're talking pre-credit card, pre-iPhone, all that. What was it like in Ponchatoula during your childhood?
Well, the upside of it is that the independence we all had as kids. I mean, we all had bikes. And there was no supervision, hardly any crime, no reason for parents to be paranoid about supervising their children. So we were able to, we'd have work-up games of baseball in Memorial Park and football, flag football in Memorial Park. Some of it reached high levels, like with my brother and Donnie and Jackie's age group. We had two young black men, Calvin Murphy and Detroit, I can't think of his name, Earl Wilson, ended up being pro baseball players that started right out there in that park with work-up games because there were no organized leagues per se or whatever. But we would do things like that. And then just downtown, we had Gene's Bakery, which was a great hangout, and kids would go in and eat donuts and stuff like that. We had Puka Landry's vegetable stand where we go by and buy an individual apple or a peach or something like that. Things like that were they were just part of your everyday existence.
Do you remember what things cost, like a hamburger, a soda?
I remember we had the Coffee Pot, was a very popular, really neat cafe downtown. It had marble countertops and stuff.
Yeah.
But I remember, I guess almost up through high school, that a hamburger was a quarter, and of course a pop was a nickel.
Oh, wow.
So for 30 cents, you could eat a pretty good lunch.
What about, I've been told that Ponchatoula used to have several movie theaters. Was that still the case in your childhood?
And the Pick. Yeah.
Okay. What did it cost to go to the movies back then?
I think it was 6 cents. 6 cents. That's how much I remember when it was such a big hoorah when RC and Coke went up from a nickel to 6 cents. Everybody thought it was outrageous.
And was the drive-through in Hammond open back then, or was that later? Or
no, that was a little. Well, in high school, the Rushes was open.
Okay.
Which was the first big hangout up there in Hammond. Yeah.
What about for other recreation, like campgrounds? You know, you always hear people in New Orleans talk about Pontchartrain Beach. You hear people around here talk about Ponchatoula Beach.
Oh, we had Ponchatoula Beach.
What was that like?
As a matter of fact, most of us football players, Dwight and me and others, Carl, were lifeguards out at Ponchatoula Beach. Mm-hmm. But the Welleses had a really big deal going in the old days.
And you're referring to your dear friend Sparky Wells, his parents, Shirley and John Wells,
Shirley and John Wells, who were two more great mentors of mine. Shirley Wells is just one of my heroes.
Yeah, for sure. I think she went skydiving when she was like 94 or something.
Oh my God! I couldn't believe it.
I always think, you know, if we all love that commercial, The Most Interesting Man in the World, the Dos Equis beer guy. Yeah. Shirley would be the most interesting woman in the world for sure.
Absolutely, she beat me a mile. Here I am trying to convince her not to do it. I'm being the old prune. I'm going, ooh, I thought I was a daredevil. No, I'm not.
That's funny.
But anyway. The beach was something. They had huge rope swings that people could go off of. They had a big beach. They had floats out there. We put on a ski show, a Cypress Gardens type ski show.
Whoa.
All the Murray Cleveland and Carl Cleveland and me and just a whole bunch of Janine Williams and Lonnie Williams and just a whole bunch of locals. And we'd do pyramids on skis, and we'd ski barefooted. And the people
right there in the Tangipahoa River.
Right on the Tangipahoa River there, yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. Well, let's talk a little bit, Dad. You know, we've mentioned kind of the contrast of then and now. Give me your outlook on where Ponchatoula is now. How do you think it's going now? Where do you think it's going in the future? You know, what are your thoughts on the place you live now?
I think the core of Ponchatoula is still very good, and I think the advent of most of the new people I've met who have tried to get away from hurricanes and everything else seem to be very wonderful people who have a good community spirit themselves. So I think in terms of all of modern America, I think Ponchatoula is ahead of the curve. I know our violence isn't as bad. There's never been any huge racism problems and things of that nature in Ponchatoula. I think we're still just a good family-oriented community, and we're not without our problems. You know, your brother's the chief of police, and I was the sheriff, and it's a constant battle to keep violent crime and massive drug abuse under control.
Sure.
But if you look at the number of arrests, and you look at the number of instances, and you look at things like that, once again, we're way ahead of the curve. We are relatively very well off in terms of not having tremendous bad crime. And,
right.
And that's part of a modern America, and we're very fortunate to be that way. So, and I give credit to Bree, but I give credit to the whole community. It's just everybody is of a like notion of they want to keep a wholesome community, and we're doing a pretty good job of it.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're optimistic that we are, remaining ahead of the curve. We're not without every area has a little bit of this and that. Everybody's got some violence, some racism, some other problem.
Right.
But historically, for 100 plus years, Ponchatoula has done better than our surrounding community, than the surrounding states. And it sounds like you think we will continue to do that, at least for the near future. Is that right?
I think so. I think as long as you can keep the family values, you keep an interest in your children, I think we'll continue to be that way. I feel that way strongly,
What advice would you give to someone who's thinking about either moving here, visiting here, starting a business here? Just what would you say to someone who's not familiar with Ponchatoula but has their eye on this community and is thinking about making a life here?
I would say just some of the things we just discussed. That one, we're a broad-minded, wholesome community. We're open to a lot of different avenues of different new ideas and stuff like that. We've got a wonderful educational system. We always have. Ponchatoula High has academically always been excellent, and, as well as our primary schools.
Sure.
Our little Catholic school is just, we all went there.
Even when you were at St. Joe with the nuns, the old crows, it was good.
I know.
Still kicking
I didn't
butt.
call them that, Sister Mildred.
That was
so put that one on Parker.
Put that, Uh-oh, I'm in trouble. Yeah. I'll never forget when I was a kid, the nuns left when I was in the lower grades, 3rd, 4th grade, somewhere in there. And I think we had 3 nuns. You know, we had the principal and 2 teachers. And when they left, we had like a big parade. And I feel guilty admitting this now, but at the time it was very real that we were cheering loudly. And I'm sure that the nuns thought we were cheering appreciatively, but we were cheering like, the nuns are gone, the nuns are gone. I feel bad saying that now. Those ladies
I'm not going
to
comment on that part.
But I can relate to what you and Uncle Carl did. It's one of those things, what you do in your youth, you don't condone as an adult and as a parent. Well, let me ask you this, Pop. One, we're nearing an hour. It's been outstanding, and we didn't even get to talk about the things that people know you best for, being the sheriff and serving our community and leading our community. So I hope you might be interested in coming back another day so we can dig into that, because we couldn't do it justice in just a moment now. But I want to ask you as a final parting shot, is there anything else you want to share with our listeners? Anything we didn't cover that you feel like we should address before we close?
Well, I mean, there's a world in there we didn't cover and couldn't cover.
Yeah, right.
It would take too long. No, I'm just appreciative of Inez and Louis Layrisson adopting me and bringing me to such a wonderful place. I'm so appreciative. We talked about just me in this interview or whatever, but not only like having Coach Shield and Coach Johnson, but the brotherhood I had with all the people I played with in football and sports, and all the friends I had at Ponchatoula High, and just the quality people that just molded me and inspired my life. I was lucky to be in Ponchatoula and be raised in this environment. And to this day, I mean, when I see old classmates from the 50s and 60s and all, it's just still a good smile comes across you, because I've been blessed to be raised in a community with so many good people.
Well, for sure. And I tell you, Dad, we are so blessed that you came back to raise us kids here. You know, your 4 sons had a wonderful childhood here. And certainly this community was blessed that you came here to serve as our sheriff and protect us from those problems you talked about earlier. So, folks, that's it for what I hope is part 1 of Eddie Layrisson, our longtime retired sheriff and my dad and my hero. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time on the Ponchatoula Podcast. Taste of Tangi is the portion of the podcast where I share something about the delicious food that we have to offer here in the Tangipahoa Parish area. And today I'm especially excited to talk about this restaurant that I'm going to recommend, because it's an institution. It is probably the most famous restaurant in our area. It is definitely an incredible experience. Whether you're going there just to eat, the food's incredible. It's going to check all the boxes there. Or whether you're going there for an experience, it's got great atmosphere. It's got great location. It's got a great story. It's just an incredible place. And so, obviously, I'm talking about Middendorf's, located in Manchac, Louisiana, approximately 8 miles south of Ponchatoula. So it's right down the road. You can take the interstate and get there in a jiffy, or if you want to take a few more minutes, like I usually do, take the old low road. You might see an alligator crossing the highway. Not making that up. That's happened to me and many others many times. Middendorf's is, of course, best known for its thin-cut catfish. It may have invented thin-cut catfish. I'm not sure of the history there, but I know that people come in from all over the world, including camera crews. Several national and international TV shows have filmed on location to check out Middendorf's. Its owners, Horst and Karen Pfeiffer, are wonderful people. They have not only improved that restaurant tremendously since buying it, but they've improved our area. They volunteer, they donate, they do more for the community than just about anybody I know. We are so lucky that Horst came all the way from Germany to live here, and Karen came all the way from Kansas to make her home here. They are wonderful additions to our community. Of course, there's much more than fried catfish to eat there. There's delicious fresh seafood of all kinds, shrimp and oysters and even soft-shell crabs. The best kept secret on the menu has to be their oyster stew. It's one of a kind. It's delicious. They also have great seasonal menus. Right now it's October, and with German-owned Horst Pfeiffer running the show, they've got an incredible Oktoberfest menu you want to check out. Other times of the year, they make delicious handmade pasta. They just do some incredible things there, and it's located right here near Ponchatoula in Manchac, right off of I-55. That's why it's easy for me to recommend Middendorf Seafood as today's Taste of Tangi. On today's Parker's Pick, we're talking about flowers. Specifically, I'm going to recommend to you what I believe to be the very best florist in the state of Louisiana, maybe the best in the country. And that's Samantha Bates at Especially for You Florist right here in Ponchatoula. Now, I wouldn't make such an outlandish claim without some stats or facts to back it up. Samantha is the 2014 Louisiana State Designer of the Year. She has also won many competitions and awards for floral design, and she's competed on behalf of our country at the Gateway to America's Cup. So she's won the Jim Johnson Cup, many other awards. So those of you that know floral design and know florists, you know she's a really big deal, not just here locally, but on the statewide and national and international levels. How do I know that they're good? Well, mainly because my wife has been happy with her flowers. If you know Brandy, you know that she has very high standards. You know that she is not shy about expressing her standards. And she chose Samantha, and Especially for You Florist, to do the flowers at our wedding. And she's very particular, Brandy, and she was very happy with the results. We have used Especially for You many times since then to send flowers for all occasions, from Valentine's Day to funerals. They have nailed it every time. They always get it right. They are a pleasure to work with. And that's why it's easy for me to recommend Samantha Bates and Especially for You Florist, located here in Ponchatoula on Pine Street, as today's Parker's Pick. Because this show is new, any and all support is greatly appreciated. If you haven't already done so, number one, subscribe at the Apple Podcasts app or iTunes or Stitcher or Android, wherever you listen to podcasts. Number two, and this is important, write a 5-star rating and review the podcast. Number three, and this is the biggest, most important thing you could do, share it with your friends. We've got a Facebook page under the name The Ponchatoula Podcast. Check it out, like it, share it. You're going to see information about who we're interviewing, what's coming up. If you really want to get local news about Ponchatoula, Hammond, if you want to hear about local people here in Tangipahoa Parish, please support our podcast. We will be happy to share that information, but we need your help to make this thing a success. So thank you so much. I'm very excited to get going. I've lived here my whole life. I love this area, the people that live here, the things to do here, the food we cook here, etc. I could go on, but we'll do that later in subsequent episodes. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, and I can't wait to share the Ponchatoula Podcast with you.